Welcome everyone to our webinar series on research, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm Antonin Charay and from the University of Oxford, and this webinar is the third of 4 webinars that we're doing on research. The previous 2 are already available online on the CGHE website and discuss the Research project, professional service and administrative staff in higher education. And the final webinar, for which we hope you'll be able to join us, will take place this Thursday and will deal with open science. You'll be able to find more information on the CGHE website. We will also be sharing a link in the chat area. But for today's webinar, we will discuss the topic of research assessment and impact. And we welcome Dr. Gemma Derrick, who is one of the researchers on the Research project and Associate Professor of Research Policy and Culture at the University of Bristol, and Dr. Julie Bayley, who is Director of Research Impact Development at the University of Lincoln and Director of the Lincoln Impact Literacy Institute. But before I hand over to Julie and Gemma, as usual for CGHE webinars, before we get to the presentations, I'll make some brief housekeeping announcements. Please note that the session is being recorded, and please keep your cameras and microphones off during the talk. However, please do turn your cameras and your microphone on when you're invited to ask a question live. During the talk, we'd really appreciate if you could ask your questions in the chat area, and I'll invite you to ask your question when we get to the Q&A session. I can also read out the question out for you if you're unable to use the microphone. And also feel free to use the different speaker views available to you in order to have a better experience of the webinar. I think that about wraps it up for the housekeeping announcement, and I will hand it over to our presenters. So over to you, Julie.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for the invitation today. I will start the session off today, and then I'll hand over to Gemma. So let's hope the technical gods are with us while I share my screen with you. And I will invite the organisers to tell me if there's a problem with this. My name is Julie Bayley. I am Director of Research Impact at the University of Lincoln, and my various contact details are there. What I'm going to talk to you about today, quite briefly, is about healthier approaches to impact. We're talking about impact assessment, of course, and for purposes of being brief, I'm going to highlight some of the kind of challenges and risks, but I don't want this to sound pessimistic, nor is this a suggestion that we are doing things badly in the sector at all. So I'm going to talk briefly about impact within the sector, flip over to some reflections from practice. And when I say practice here, I work as an impact leader in the university, but I also do a lot of consultancy around the sector and so forth. I'm a patient rep too, so my reflections are from those various points, and then taking us towards healthier practice. And the first thing I want to do is just put us on the same page here when we're talking about impact. So impact is, the definition I always use is provable effects or benefits of research in the real world. We'll come on to benefits in a few moments, but it's really a reminder that when we talk about impact, it's the contribution we make to the wider society. So not just knowing within academia, but translating that in some way into something being different, better, changed, whatever it may be in each territory. And we have a number of drivers, and I'm not going to go into each of these in huge amounts of detail, but I just want to reflect the fact that so often impact is conflated with formal assessments. And of course, we do have formal assessments such as the REF, and our funders require it. And that, I would say, comes under the we must agenda. And that's a double-edged sword. Sometimes it's fantastic for driving impact, and REF actually has been such a prompt to do that. Challenges afoot, and we'll come on to those. But we must, as drivers, to jump the fence a little more towards social change. But also we have broader missions, sustainable development goals, etc., that say, we should use universities, use research as an engine for change for good. But there's a third one there, which I've said is we or I want to. For so many of us, impact is a sense of duty, a sense of purpose, that we have an opportunity, often not afforded to many people in society, to make a change, to have a voice, and where we can, we should. And I wanted to start off with those slides to remind us that when we talk about impact, we talk about something beyond assessment, although that's where our conversation is going to be today. And just to round this little part off, a reminder from my colleague, David Phipps in Canada, he runs Research Impact Canada, reminds us all, and I borrow this slide routinely, that it is part of human rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to share in scientific advancement and its benefits. Now, if we take scientific to mean research, it is not just nice to have impact, but actually there is a duty on us within the sector to make a difference where we can. And put bluntly, if impact were a person, it would be asking you, how can you make the world a bit better with research? That's all impact is asking. We have all sorts of rules and requirements and things we need to add on to that, but that's what's at the heart of impact. And that's the thing we should routinely hold on to when we're thinking about doing this in a healthy way. So I want to take us now into some reflections, and these are things that I see in practice, but also I just want to headline where some of the risks are, the challenges and the opportunities. Again, not being pessimistic or suggesting we don't do these. I just want to raise the conversation on these issues. So the first thing is, and it sounds ridiculous, we assess what's submitted for assessment. As I said flippantly there, I appreciate it's not a surprise. The point being that when we're talking about impact assessment and healthy impact assessment, we have to recognise that there is a filtering process that gets through to the assessment. So the things we assess are a snapshot of what has been done. And my argument is that if we're to have healthy assessment of impact, we have to have healthy conditions to produce the impact that gets there. So let's go through some of those. I think we have in the sector developed a mental and systemic blueprint for what impact is, very much so in some of our assessment-driven countries, but also in funder-driven territories and elsewhere. We have this sense of what is impact, and that gives us a kind of mental guide for who does it, who doesn't, what counts, what doesn't, what's good, what isn't. We've kind of calibrated ourselves to get a sense of what impact is in good terms, what it is in bad terms. And that has real consequences for things like resource allocation. So particularly in cash-strapped universities, resources are offered only to those doing, say, a case study, because that's what counts as good impact. And things like staff development, do you do impact or do you not do impact? And also the selection of the impact we pursue. If we don't have lots of time and money, we're going to chase the biggest ones we can have. So there are real implications for that blueprint we've established. And I think we really have an opportunity to redraw that blueprint. And whether it's whether we think that blueprint has been enforced on us or if we create it ourselves is a separate question. But the opportunity to say, what are we calibrating as good change versus, what are the opportunities around us is a very open question, and we should absolutely pursue it. The second thing to say is that selectivity within assessment. So we assess a subsection of what we do in impact, gives us a narrow snapshot. So just to illustrate that point, universities do an awful lot of things to have influence. We research, we teach, we do consultancy, etc. If we think about REF, and I'll use that as our example just for this slide, we progressively filter that to say, okay, we're only going to look at the things that come through research. And then we're only going to look at the things that are undertaken at the institution from a certain date. And then only where impact has come from certain dates that has evidence of impact. And then we kind of do a selection process where we select the best cases according to the quota we need. And that leads us to a set of case studies. Now, that implicitly has some very reasonable timescales attached to it, and we need to contain it in some way. The only message I want to give is, if we look at that, we can see that the things that go through to assessment are a very small focused part of this bigger picture, and it does sometimes bring some tensions. And one of the most common things it does is it unitizes impact as the case study. So our language has evolved to talk about impact case studies as the thing that contains impact. And actually, case studies are just one documentary derivative of the wider set of things we do. But it has consequences for things like our reward and recognition processes, acknowledgement of impact that happens outside of that. So I want us to try and decouple that sense of impact being a case study. A case study is a demonstration of impact, but is not the same thing. And if we choose to recognize that impact case studies are selective, fine, then we can widen what we acknowledge. And I point here to the hidden REF. which Gemma may speak to, but certainly is a massive kind of groundswell of activity to widen this sense of contribution, who does impact, what counts. And by doing so, we can widen the acknowledgement. I say this quite a lot as well. Our next point is that we have a tendency to chase impact unicorns. What I mean by that is, because of this process of trying to get the best things into assessment, we chase the biggest, shiniest versions of impact we have. And that can sometimes lead us to pursue the big and shiny versus the things that are around us that matter. Now, chasing the big impacts is not in itself a problem. Of course not. Making big social change is a fantastic thing. The issue is when it blinds us or draws us away from the meaningful difference we can have around our region, in our classrooms, or whatever that may be. And if we pursue what's going to score well, rather than what matters for society, it can have a real damaging effect on our relationships with society, because it reinforces the ivory tower feel, and where we should be working in partnership, it looks like we're glory hunting. It's obviously a very harsh way of saying it, but there's a possibility is there. We need to chase meaning. We need to put meaning at the heart of this. We need to co-produce. We need to work with people to find out what matters to them. A handful more of these. I say this routinely. Impact case studies show the sausages, not the sausage factory. Now, impact case studies are incredible things, and anyone who's had a case study should be immensely proud, because they are packed full of immense effort, immense achievement, all of those things. The point is that because they are written to be submitted to an assessment process, we have screened out where it went wrong, where it failed, where something, a dead end was reached. And because of that, we've created this kind of corpus that says impact is always extensive, it's neat, and it's devoid of challenges. I see too commonly people feeling then they are a failure because they don't meet that. This imposter syndrome is very, very common, and it places often unfair expectations on people for what impact they can achieve. And I hate seeing the sense of failure. It's heartbreaking seeing people feel like they're failures because they haven't met these glorious standards. So we just need to share what works and what doesn't work alongside marking these wonderful stories of impact. And at this point, I'm actually going to point to Gemma's work again on Grimpact, because this is a body of work. It's a live project to gather those stories where impact didn't work, where the process soured things, because by doing that, we can try and avoid those pitfalls in the future. So do please go and have a look at that. Now, Gemma and I have got one common slide between us, and this is it. I'm just going to talk to my part of it for a moment, and then Gemma will speak to hers in a few minutes. So we're talking about integrity. Integrity is so important to everything we do in research, impact, all of it. And there are integrity issues for peer assessment, and there's integrity issues for impact. So if we look at the bottom line here, 3 key integrity issues for healthy approaches to impact are that there is trust in the process of developing impact. For example, that academics feel they have a fair crack of the whip, that they are not excluded from it because they haven't got big shiny impact or anything in that territory. We also need to make sure that there is social trust in the intentions of academics to help society, not just help themselves. And there needs to be trust that the outcomes are meaningful. So the changes we make matter to society. And Gemma will come back to this slide with it reflecting on peer review, but it's important we remember trust is at the base of so much of what we do. Now, I don't want that to sound pessimistic, because certainly over the years, I've seen a huge kind of uplift in healthier approaches to impact, and it's an incredible privilege to be part of that. All I've done here is kind of snapshotted a few particular threads of evolution in impact terms. So the first one is responsible research assessment. I've tagged Dora and Koara on here. Declaration on Research Assessment and the Coalition Advancing Research Assessment. Both of these speak to responsible assessment, so not just metricizing, not just counting, not just ranking. And by definition, impact can inherit the developments there, the more responsible, more appropriate means of doing assessment, and I absolutely hope it will. I've mentioned here research strategies with and then for impact. If we look over successive rep cycles, there's a fairly typical progression of research strategies in universities which went from the word impact pretty much being absent from strategies, or just research, saying with impact, through to now, which are strategies driving implementation, driving transformative change. We have absolutely integrated the language of impact into so many of our strategies. So it's a really positive shift. There's a massive uplift and recognition of the value of engagement and co-production. We've seen that in REF's change of language around the category for impacts, now engagement and impact. But we also see it in the work of NCCPE, Research Impact Canada. I mean, there's many organisations I can point to that say, if we're going to do impact well, we have to work with society, not just do things for or on society. Responsible approaches, I mentioned harnessing the metric tide, but anything in and around responsible metrics, responsible assessment, wider contributions, I've already mentioned the hidden ref, but that sense of widening the picture for who does impact and what matters. And then for myself, my own work is around impact literacy. In basic terms, if we're going to do impact well, we need the opportunity to understand what it is and understand how to work with people, work within the context of our pressured academic lives to do this well. And I'll move on to the impact environment in a second. The headline here is that put together, we can see a far more supported, connected, meaning healthier impact environment building. And I am delighted that it's going in that way. There's a link there as well to a paper on some of this. So just to leave this section on this last slide, myself and David Fix do work on institutional health. And one of the reasons for this is we have seen some poor practice being pressure exerted on people to do impact without necessarily the support structures to help them do it. And we offer these 5 C's. So I just wanted to finish the session on these to invite you to think about these. We say there needs to be commitment from the institution or team department, whichever structural level we're talking about, to make sure impact's valued, not just expected, that people's competencies are built so that staff have the right skills and aren't just kind of launched in, sink or swim, that there is clarity on what impact is and what people's roles do to contribute to that. And then the teams within an institution connect so that the researchers connect with the research managers, with the comms officers, with the librarians, whatever connection it is, because we have such expertise in our institutions. It's incredible often we work in such a siloed way. And finally on there, but certainly not least important, is co-production, that we invest in working with society meaningfully in a strong, sustained way to make impact meaningful and make it a reality. And again, there's a paper there. I mentioned just earlier in the talk, if impact were a person, it'd be asking you, how you can make the world a bit better with your research. My final word is this, that we need to ask ourselves as a sector how we can do that in a healthy way for everyone involved, including our researchers and everyone inside our institutions. There's my contact details. Thank you very much, and I will hand back over.
Thank you very much, Julie. Gemma, over to you.
Thanks, Antonin. Let me just get this going so that we have it. Can everyone see that? Just a yes or no is good. Thanks so much, guys. Thanks, Julie. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for those plugs by Julie, who is probably one of the people in this field that I admire, and I'm so lucky to have her as a colleague and a friend in this field. She's just phenomenal. So to receive plug-in of 2 of my projects that are going on, both the Grimpact and the Hidden Ref, is phenomenal. So thank you. Right back at you, Julie. I'm not talking about Grimpact and the Hidden Ref today, although what I'm talking about here is forming part of the Grimpact project, but specifically focused on the work that I did with the Research Council of Norway on their ex-ante impact statements. And I wanted to talk about the use of hype. Specifically, if we look back to the, if we look to this to this slide that Julie and I both shared, I'm going to be talking about the top process, which is trust in the peer review process and the evaluation process of impact. And specifically, I want to question this idea about what do we mean by assessment integrity, focusing in on that word of integrity. And for me, when it comes to evaluation process and based on the literature, there are three main components that contribute to the integrity of a research process or evaluation process when it comes to evaluating impact. The first is trust that the process was conducted fairly, regardless of whether you are successful in getting funding or not successful getting funding. You are more likely to accept the outcomes as just if you think the process was conducted fairly. And linked to that, but still separate, is trust in the expertise of the evaluators. If you know my work for 2018, the expertise of the evaluation as impact experts was perhaps a little bit contested. But specifically, when we talk about assessment integrity more broadly, we're talking about whether the applicants were somehow unfairly or unduly influenced by something that was not necessarily in line with the criterion that they were duty-bound to assess, which is research impact or other aspects such as research excellence. So there's an idea that the expertise of the evaluators know what they're evaluating of because they have both lived it as well as evaluated it in the past as well. And the third part of research integrity, which is again a very contested one, but is mainly associated with, assessments and research that looks at peer review and whether or not we got the outcomes right, is that trust that the outcomes, whatever they were, whether you as an applicant are included or not, are the right ones. So the point being is that if we have these three things in line in an evaluation process, there is more likely that the research community will trust that the assessment was conducted with integrity. That being said, ex-ante impact assessment, so this is assessment of impact that is yet to happen and is usually associated with the impacts that you see in grants before, asking permission and funding to do research in the future with the promise and the expectation that it will somehow contribute to society. It's a little bit different from ex-post impact assessment that is done in audit frameworks such as the REF and its assessment like Cousins in other countries. And the reason is because it's not necessarily based on indicators or a value judgment about one indicator versus another about what has been achieved. But it's about assessing things like feasibility against risk. And when I talk about risk, whether the impacts as they were envisaged in the applications, the risk that they will happen and that they will happen in line with what is promised in the assessment. It's not necessarily about rewarding or recognition, such as, you've done a good job, here's a pat on the back, but more like, you've done a real good job of convincing me that this is worth funding, here's some money in replace of a pat on the back. And I use a lot of very older research about looking at evaluating the social returns from public health research, which was Alexander and Forlandia in 1989 and Wydalski in 1973, about decision-making in times of uncertainty. And in a way, this encompasses what we're looking when we're coming into ex-ante impact assessment, is we're looking at an idea of you're making a decision but based on incomplete or uncertain information as presented in the application, especially in relation to impact, where anything in the future can happen and not everything, including the research itself, always goes according to plan. So when we look about this, there's this genre in the literature at the moment that's saying hype language or this persuasive genre of writing is somehow harmful to the research integrity of the assessment process. And when we used hype, if we go back to a lot of linguists, we talk about using hyperbolic or promotional language to glamorize, publicize, embroider, and or exaggerate aspects of their research. And anybody who's ever put a grant application or indeed a REF impact statement or a research environment statement is probably guilty of using a little bit of what they term hype language in order to perhaps see yourself or paint yourself as more worthy of recognition, esteem, or funding than your other applicants. Problem here is that using hype is usually associated with getting a one-up on your applicant. So promoting yourself as more worthy of funding than somebody else. But that is really interesting when we're talking about ex-ante impact, for the sake as you don't know who else is actually applying at that point in time, and you probably haven't seen their application at the time of submission. So what exactly you're trying to achieve by using hype language. And when I talk about hype language, there was a very interesting study published in Higher Education quite recently by Hailan Young in 2023 that basically said that these hype language or these hyperbolic terms, or what they call drama words, value-laden vocabulary, positive words and superlatives, were actually questioning the integrity of the research impact evaluation process as it was done in REF. And I got a bit confused with this because I don't necessarily see hype as problematic. And when we see words as extremely, superbly, completely new, critically important, and even the word significant classified as hype language, I'm just wondering, I wanted to test, based on a database that I had and knowledge that I had, about whether this was actually a problem to the integrity of the process. So who cares about hype? Again, this is just to estimate what I said before, is that hype is somehow threatening the integrity of the assessment process. And to take the two lines that were from Hailan's article more specifically, their assumption was that the writers felt that the value of these types of impact would not be immediately apparent to the assessors, evaluators, and so somehow required additional finessing through hype to persuade the evaluators of their value. And in the end, in their description, they said, our work offers empirical evidence in the form of academic rhetorical practices, which supports what may be a decline in engagement with the values of integrity and objectivity. So I wanted to test that based on an assessment that I did. Again, keeping in mind, but what do we mean by research integrity is these three things at the top. Trust that the process is conducted fairly, trust in the expertise of the evaluators, and trust that the outcomes are right. Hailan's concern was specifically associated with the fact that the expertise in the evaluators was somehow misladen or swayed due to this hype language, and that this would somehow convince them to produce outcomes that were not quite right, as in this assessment. So what did I do? Fine. The first thing that I did is I took a lot of applications to the Research Council of Norway, ex-ante implications for funding, and I did a linguistic analysis of the impact sections. In the Research Council of Norway, the criteria are three separate parts of the application. The first is excellence, the third is impact, and the fourth is implementation. And I specifically concentrated on the impact section. So what are they promising is going to happen in the future, and how are they painting this as a feasible and risk-free way of funding the research? But I topped this also off with observing the panelists themselves. So I was very privileged, I guess, during the COVID pandemic to be able to look at to observe panel deliberations around these applications that were conducted mainly online because nobody could travel to Norway at that time. Funnily enough, the majority of evaluations right now are still conducted online. So that means that for empirical sociologists such as myself, this means that I have a lot of opportunities to observe what's going on. Specifically, I looked at the impact section of the proposals. There are three different parts of the template that you need to fill out at the Research Council of Norway to be assessed. And I specifically focused on the middle one, which is the impact, which is the potential for the outcomes and impact of the proposed research and innovation, as well as aspects of communication and research exploitation towards the benefits of society. And of course, I took 2 different years as well. In 2019, this new structure of research applications was brought in, and impact was introduced for the first time as an essential component for people to consider. At that point, impact was actually very much considered something either societal or scientific impact, and it was left up to the the applicants themselves to express what they thought were going to be the very important impact stemming from their research. And what this also means is that we have a very interesting time frame when we compare it to a present sort of data that we have in 2022 that looked at, basically gives us an idea about how people initially responded to the impact criterion and how they've adapted 4 years later in 2022 to the same criterion as well. We did this over a number of social science and humanities panels. Specifically, they were political science and history, and as well as welfare and living conditions and aesthetic studies. We saw that welfare and living conditions and political sciences were going to be more amenable to societal impacts as per scientific impacts, just mainly due to the description of the panels that were taken on for evaluating these proposals. And again, in 2019, when we looked at the opening sentences, we did see very much variation. You either had very much against impact on society, so basically I'm doing scientific impact and basically that's it, versus a more balanced approach, which is more hedging their bets between the idea of, yes, we're going to do great research, but we're also going to have societal benefits at the same time. I must actually say that there was one person who wrote in their application in 2019, I'm not going to have any societal benefits, so I'm not filling out this section, which gives you an idea about the extent to how people initially reacted to this changing criterion, and also the introduction as impact as a formalized criterion. But more importantly, when we looked at the proposals themselves, we identified three main components of the impact that were in the impact components. And we've called this inspirations, which were linguistics or illustrative tools that evoked a wider non-academic relevance to the project without necessarily linking it to the project itself. So this is what, this was illusions of danger or problems that they used. And the second one was promises. This was a claim that they had in the impact statement that they would have an impact, but it was usually made divorced about whether or not, or possibilities or plans about how that would be delivered. And the third one was qualifiers. Qualifiers would ground the inspirations and the promises with previous expertise or the necessary capacity to deliver it. It was more in line with what we would commonly associate as track record for scientific impact. When we looked at inspirations, we saw these very interestingly. They usually elicited an emotive response, the illustration of the promise that they would deliver on. Usually this was a societal problem, such as challenges related to elder care of a global concern, as well as societies and states are at the crossroads in how children are treated and how their rights are respected and protected. That's the problem. So this is where they're going to go. Children's new position and their strong rights create tensions and challenges to the traditional relationships between challenges and family and the state. So here you see in bold the idea of this. Height was very important in these inspirations because it elicited this emotional response. It would try to get the applicant, the assessor on board with the promises that this research was important and that it had a place in society. And this was tooled in what I will call the frame as a promise. This was the creation that an idea that an impact will be made that wasn't necessarily made in the presence of a plan on how to achieve that. Usually I called them pie in the sky. But again, you will see the use of hype in talking about we're going to produce something that would be in higher demand or findings would be particularly relevant, etc. And again, when we talk about qualifiers, these were more in line with the track records. These were claims that grounded the inspirations and basically gave more credibility to the section itself. But again, we see hype in how people talked about their past achievement too. Here we're talking about hype that it looked at personal esteem, personal reputation that were important, such as the hugely popular public lecture series that an applicant had previously done. What qualifiers did, obviously, in this case, is they acted to increase the credibility, whereas inspirations and promises acted within the frame of the impact criterion. The presence of the qualifier or the absence of the qualifier would actually act to either increase or decrease the credibility and therefore the scoring of the impact themselves. And we found no significant difference in 2019 between the scoring model of each impact, but we did see a significant difference in the 2022. Proposals. But then I went down and had a look at the panels. Some of the panels were the same, some of the panels were different, but all of the applications under consideration in each of these panels contained these three elements. So we went to test this frame and specifically how they reacted to inspirations and promises, as these were the two parts of the research that we saw were more amenable to hype language. Within the frame, what we did is inspirations and promises acted as a negotiation between the benefits versus risk of the evaluation. And again, we saw that credibility was the combined influence of the qualifiers and the frames, and that the qualifiers again grounded the inspiration. But when we looked at actually how the panel reacted to aspects of hype, we saw that it was a non-issue. When we're talking about the integrity of the process, the integrity of the peer review process, we are specifically talking about people who are evaluating other people. They are not robots. They are not unduly influenced in any way, shape, or form. They are actually very much acute to the types of linguistic tools that their peers as researchers themselves use to promote this genre of writing, this grant genre of writing. It's quite normal. And in fact, when something was overhyped, especially within the impact criterion, this actually acted to negate the credibility and therefore downplay the score of the overall impact section, with one reviewer actually stating quite forcefully during the panel observations in the presence of what he would classify as an overhyped response that this impact is crazy, and therefore the benefit and versus risk balance was negated, and the credibility of the overall impact section was also decreased. So contrary to what we are concerned about and what the powers that be are concerned about when talking about the use of hype language to somehow denigrate the integrity of the research process, any integrity of the research process is actually meted by individuals who are very sensitive to overhyped language. And in fact, we would perhaps argue, contrary to concerns, is that the use of the evaluators who would use overhyped language as negating the credibility and therefore score of the proposals actually would increase, by their definitions, would increase the integrity of the research assessment process, not necessarily decrease it. They found that the overpromotion or excessive name dropping or use of hype in overestimating the potential of research, especially within the frame in relation to inspiration promising, was grating or grates, and this resulted in lower credibility. I needed to talk about this because panels use the inspiration, which is the section with the most hype language, to negate the risk of the future potential impact, but also to visualize the benefit. And in here, hype actually works quite well. It is the ability of the project that inspires and the possibility that the impact will lead to real change, which were very important. And this went above and beyond and through the use of any hype language that was used by applicants in the proposal themselves. And in fact, if you didn't inspire your evaluators, you're more likely to reduce your credibility too. So hype is actually used as a tool for an evaluation, not anything that risks the evaluation itself. So when we look at the components that hype can action on, and actually when we talk about how individuals mediate between the different components of an impact statements, we see the frame is really important. But when we talk about the frame, we're really talking about the inspiration that is used to mediate, which are used to illustrate the problem and is more in line with the use of hype language, but also a really very much grounded, realistic idea about risks versus benefits. And where hype language was seen to be increased, the risk of the proposal was also seen to be increased. And so this means that within the frame, hype actually used to negate any ill-due effect it might have had on the integrity of the research assessment process by using over-hyped language within the inspirations. But again, all of these were negated by the existence of qualifiers. Regardless of this person, regardless of whether the applicant was using hype language or not within the frame, the presence of a qualifier is used to negate and create trust and feasibility in the assessment of impact, and trust that the evaluation would that the impact would continue as planned and as visualized by the applicant themselves. So if we take this and we take it into like a way in which these these components of the application are used to as a mediation in the peer review process, we see the frame as a constant flux between the benefits and risks and also the inspiration. So the inspiration doesn't act alone. Inspiration, which is mainly pertained to hype language, doesn't necessarily act in the absence of an assessment that can be used to negate any undue influence of hype language. And in fact, the qualifiers themselves on the outside would also be used to balance that as well. In a way, hype can help the evaluation, not as a threat to the evaluation process itself. So I wanted to ask the question at the end of this, is hype necessary to evaluate proposals? Anybody who's gone through 100 proposals as part of a peer review process can know that, yes, it can be grating and tiring at the best of times. So hype is really actually quite necessary for the evaluators, not only to stay awake during the process, but also to see whether the person's enthusiasm for doing the project is genuine or not. So is hype necessary to evaluate proposals? Yes, it is. But it's mediated within a balancing of benefits and risks and used to offset uncertainty. It doesn't confuse the process and it doesn't risk the integrity of the evaluation itself. Oops, I've gone too far. And actually, panels are really oversensitive to the existence of hype. So where overhyped language is used that is perhaps not justified or that is seen to be beyond their baseline immunity to hype, it's actually used to negate the credibility of panels, and it can actually decrease the score. The idea, I guess, is the fact that panels are not necessarily are immune to hype and its undue effect, but they use it as a tool to mediate the risk that the impact will go forward. So it's not a risk to the evaluation process in the moment. So what I am trying to say, I guess, is that hype is a tool. And that panelists as human beings themselves are not immune to the undue effects that hype might go through. So when we talk about this process we're doing, we know the integrity of the process is in the first line, but remember this line at the bottom, which is talking about the learning and the restructure of a value-based experience. When the outcomes come out as right, the outcomes themselves are used by the evaluation process to reformulate the assessment. Oh, my lights just went up. To reformulate how the assessment can go in the future. Assessment itself is not a static thing. It learns from its mistakes as well as from its wins. And when we talk about ex-ante assessment, when something is successful, it is also used to model future assessments again. And going into what Julie said is we assess what is submitted. This learning process and what is feeds into not necessarily how proposals are formed to the future, but how they're formulated by applicants ahead of submitting them, but also give a chance for evaluation panels to learn from them because they are submitted again. So this is how evaluation of impact seems to be working. It is an evolving process. It is a live process. It is never 100% right, but we are learning from the experience. So thank you so much. I'm just going to turn my light on.
Thank you so much, Gemma and Julie, for both of these presentations, which were really fantastic and very complimentary. So thank you so much for having put the effort of putting this session together. I'm going to open it up to the floor now to ask some questions. And if you could put your questions in the chat to start with, and I will progressively invite you to speak to ask your question to our presenters. Please do remember to turn on your camera and to turn on your microphone when you speak, and please keep yourself muted in the meantime. I'm sure we'll have quite a lot of questions following this presentation. Maybe while everybody is gathering their thoughts, I do have one question for both of you to get us started. You both spoke of two different things that kind of reminded me a little bit of each other, a little bit in your presentations. At one point, Julie, you spoke about the risk of being constantly looking for the impact unicorns. And obviously, Gemma, you spoke about hype. So I'd be a bit curious, Julie, if you could speak a little bit about your thoughts, a little bit about hype in the evaluation and assessment process. And if Gemma, you could speak a little bit about this risk sometimes of chasing impact unicorns. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm happy to. And just a comment there, just looking across the group on the screen, we've got people from so many aspects of the research landscape here, which is fantastic because essentially we're all in this together. And the reason I start with that is because when it comes to assessment and things like case studies and post research impact assessment, we feel often we're in a kind of competition entry mindset. And I don't want to do a disservice to certainly the REF team, I have a huge respect for. But I think as an institution, we end up in that kind of survival mode stance. And that's when we start to chase unicorns. We start to chase the big shiny things. And that comes with the risk of then trying to hype up the impact we have. And I think we've got much better through progressive assessment cycles, because I think in the first cycle, no one knew quite how to pitch. We have become more balanced in our language. So the risk to hype is always there, as is the risk to chase unicorns. But the counterbalance is to be more accurate, to be more fair and partnered in the way we produce these things has become a much stronger part of what we do. So the risk of hype is there, the risk of unicorns is there, but we are better at avoiding that risk.
I think for me, when we talk about impact unicorns, I use this in Grimpact as well, because we are chasing what is rewarding, and what is rewarded, irrespective of actually what our more natural and normal relationship is between our research and society. And going back to my presentation, there is a tendency, it seems, sectorially, and I have no evidence to say this, it's just more from an assessor's point of view and what I've seen and evaluated impact statements, is that we envisage impact at the ex-ante stage in order to maximize the impact at the ex-post stage at two separate stages of rewarding. So at the ex-ante stage, we're talking about getting the funding to do research, and the promise of the research is the way we envisage the outcomes of research as being rewarded as a REF case study or REF. And so the danger of chasing impact unicorns over the spectrum of the research process is that we frame only those valuable impacts at the very early stage of the research as associated only with the reward stage at the latest part of the research, rather than being open to the variety of different ways that our research can impact society positively and negatively. And again, what that does is it limits what Julie will call the impact literacy, the ability for us to envisage a relationship with society that goes beyond rewards and that goes beyond refable returns for our institutions as well. This is a tension that people have on the individual level, because again, when it's talking about contributions to ex-post assessments of impact, they see that individually in promotion applications and how they progress, and appointment applications, etc. So they feel it individually. Strategically, on an institutional level, it's very much difficult. So why am I going to get a Research Council grant might be funded at 0.8. Why am I investing 0.2 in this and to fund this research if it's not going to return to me as an organization through a successful REF return? And when you look at the value of a successful 4-star case impact study to an institution versus an output, a 4-star output, you see what's at stake. And so I don't necessarily blame the institutions for thinking this way, but I would hope that we're getting smarter about not envisaging the impact pathway as just a series of rewardable events, rather than envisaging a larger, more honest relationship with society. And I guess, can I just also say, because the opposite of Julie's impact unicorns is the risk of impact gremlins, which is basically the Grimpact aspect that we're seeing too, that I'm studying as well. And unfortunately, without going into the research, and we will see this as the book comes out, I guess, is that impact gremlins are actually far more common than we would like to believe. It's just that we don't monitor them, because we are chasing those unicorns, and we are literally narrowed by the possibility of the unicorns. We're literally, I can go analogies for crazy, but we're driven by the bright light of the unicorn, and we're ignoring what happens on the journey towards it.
Thank you very much to you both. We have a question in the chat by Shifa Prasad, if you would like to come in. Please feel free to unmute yourself and turn your camera on if you can.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have a query to what are the challenges associated with the quantifying the broader impact of research, and how we can address these challenges? Yeah.
I'm happy to start off and answer that. I mean, there are huge challenges with measuring impact. There's no question about it, because we are talking about the part of this process that falls beyond the kind of the walls of the university. So there are inherent challenges there. One of the kind of counterbalances there is, particularly in things like REF, we are not looking for evidence of every impact. We're trying to corroborate a story where we have made a difference. So there's a kind of containment on what we need to do. The challenges typically are around not knowing what the chain of events is, so where those impacts happen, and it's multiple impacts, not impact. So one change can trigger another change, can trigger another change. A second challenge is in often a presumption that things need to be metricized, and very often they don't. A qualitative change is as important. And I will very untechnically say, if it's a change in a number thing, you want numbers. If it's a change in a word thing, you want words. So there's something about matching the measurement to the type of change you're looking for. But the biggest answer to all of the challenges of measuring impact is building that sustained partnership with society, so that societal eyes are on the change and are able to connect back to what difference the research made. Every case study of impact will be different, but they are all supercharged in measurement terms by maintaining that partnership with society in some way.
Thanks.
For me, Shira, I'm just going to go back to the fact that if you create an indicator that's countable, you crowd out all the other types of behaviors that lead towards the creation of that indicator. So what I'm talking about is, if you only value and you only reward what can be seen and what can be heard, then you overlook and strategically under prioritize that can't be seen and that can't be heard, but are essential for the creation. So impact is not one person, one impact, and a causal relationship with the two. There's many different factors and people and interactions that are associated with that pathway, which if any one of these things didn't exist, then the output wouldn't be realized. And so this is kind of what we're doing with the hidden REF, is the idea that if you do not acknowledge all aspects of the research to impact pathway that are important towards its creation, then you under prioritize, you don't see them, and you increase the chance that in the future, when a similar thing happens, that they're not there to ensure that the impact is realized. That is a loss not only for universities as knowledge organizations, but as society as a whole. So this is what I was thinking.
If I could add one more thing, and I think the public patient arena is rich with this stuff, and I'm biased because that's my area, but one of the things that's coming through really strongly through that arena is patient-built impact frameworks, so outcome measures from the people. So essentially saying, if we're going to chase meaning, let's ask society what matters to them, and then measure whether that happens. It's a very overly simplified way of doing it, but we don't necessarily know what the impact is. It's following that up. And then really technically, there's lots of programs and services and all sorts of things now where you can track where work has been cited in policy and all those kind of things. So it's piecing it together as a puzzle.
Thank you very much. I think we still have time for a couple questions, if there are any. Could I also invite colleagues from the research projects that are in the room that I can see, Alice, James, or Sin, if there's any comments or questions on the presentations, feel free to jump in. Yes, Alice, please feel free to come in.
Thank you so much, Gemma and Julie. I've followed the presentations with the greatest interest. I won't take too much time because I can see that there are more questions popping up. But I was just wondering about the kind of cultural and linguistic framing of impact statements and claims to impact and so on. And perhaps you, Gemma, whether you've discussed this with Norwegian colleagues in terms of the framing of those claims in English and for an international audience, as opposed to kind of looking internally and using Norwegian.
Sorry, Alice, can you repeat that? Do you mean looking at it in a different language?
Yes, I'm sorry. There is a construction going
Okay.
So I was wondering about the fact that the claims that you're describing had been expressed in English and putatively addressed to an international audience of panelists from different countries, all having English as the shared language, but they applied to a context where English is not the everyday spoken language. So I was wondering if it looked at all into that kind of linguistic diversity aspect of it.
No, I didn't. All of them were submitted in English. It's one of the, seems to be it's not an explicit criterion, but it's seen as a competitive advantage to submit in English. I didn't notice any, this was also 2019, so this is pre-ChatGPT time. So I didn't notice any issues with the English at all. It was spotless. So I can't speak to your claim, but it is interesting, especially in environments where English is not necessarily so dominant as it is in Norway. So yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. And we have a question from Grace in the chat. Grace, would you like to come in?
Hi, thank you. Thank you for your really informative presentations there. I was just wondering if you had any top tips for how organizations can reward and recognize a diverse range of impacts in assessments.
Do you want to jump in, Gemma?
Yeah, I'm just going to say sign the 5% manifesto, which is the hidden rest manifesto to increase the number of non-traditional outputs. So that's outputs that are not from books or from scholarly articles in REF 2029. That's at an organizational level. And you can see it on the Hidden Ref website or Googling 5% manifesto Hidden Ref. I think that is, and Grace, I know it's specific, your question was specifically an impact. And I think that in a way, the variety of different contributions is more recognized in impact than it is in outputs. So I would say that if we were looking at this as a step change towards larger culture change, that signing the 5% manifesto and making sure we recognize the variety of different inputs on our outputs is probably a very important first step for organizations. Any questions? Let me know.
I'll add one quick point, which is we need to, in our institutions, decouple impact from the assessment process, have impact weaved into our progression, our funding, our research development. It needs to be a word in and of itself, of which we may harvest off for other things. As soon as we do that, we start recognizing the diversity rather than the unicorns.
Absolutely, totally what Julie says, as always.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. If we have any final comments or questions, this is the time. Gemma, Julie, do you have any final words, final contributions you'd like to add to the session?
Thanks to be here. Can I just say that working with Julie is amazing, but working on the wider research on research team, part of CG, is an absolute privilege, and I enjoy your company, Antonin, Alice's company, Jean, James, everyone. So just to call out to the team, you're brilliant. And thank you so much for the opportunity.
And I would just like to say, whoever is on this call listening, whatever you're doing, every one of us makes a contribution to this space, and we can choose that to be a positive contribution, make this a much richer environment, or we can kind of step back and let it happen. So just get involved.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to you both for your presentations, for your contributions, and for the enthusiasm in the responses. I think it was extremely informative and really great way to shape the webinar. So thank you so much to you both. The chat will be posted on the CGHE website, as will be the recording of today's presentations. And we will be really happy to welcome you to our final session, our final webinar, which will be on the theme of open science, which will feature Tony Ross-Sellower and Vincent Larivière. So please do, and be chaired by Gemma, who is present here as well. And thank you so much. And we look forward to hearing from you, keeping in touch, and seeing you all on Thursday. Have a great day.